Welcome to the UNESCO-DCMÉT Symposium, Youth Participation, Civil Engagement and Education for Democracy, Challenges and Opportunities. My name is Peter Jandrich. I'm chairing today's session, and it is a great privilege to introduce our four speakers today. I will introduce the speakers in order of appearance. It's Daniel Schugurensky, Tara Bartlett, David Zyngier, sorry I probably mispronounced your name, and Michelle Bellino. The panel will be a conversation about the challenges and opportunities faced by citizenship education initiatives in school settings in different contexts. Drawing on ethnographic and participatory methods, Michelle will share her experience with the youth action research that examines schooling as a lens into daily experiences of non-citizenship in Kenya's Kakuma refugee camp. David will share his experiences to promote citizenship education in Australia as a teacher, school principal, and elected city councilor. Tara and Daniel will talk about the experience of school participatory budgeting in Arizona, which started in one school in 2013 and currently involves 40 schools in 5 cities. So I wish warm welcome to all our speakers, and please, let's start.
So I think we said I was going to start, right? But Daniel and Tara, if you want, you're welcome to.
No, you're fine. Sorry. It's
oh, no problem.
Yeah, just go ahead, please.
Okay, well, you know what? Before I share my screen, let me just show you. I have a napping cat and dog here. This guy might get loud. There's another beagle floating around my house, so it's not ideal. I've got 2 loud dogs, but hopefully I will build your, sympathy now at the front end. Share screen. Oh, it looks like the host has disabled screen sharing. Is Daryl still with us?
I can allow you. 1 second.
Okay, thank you. I'm still not allowed. There we go. Okay. All right. Okay, I think you can all see my screen there. Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Michelle Bolino. I'm a faculty member at the University of Michigan. I'm really excited to be here, and I'll be reflecting in our time together on some research that I've done in collaboration with young people living in Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya. Thank you so much for inviting me to share some of this work. I'm excited to be here in really good company. And like my fellow panelists, I think I'm going to try to keep this as close to 10 minutes as possible, which means, of course, lots of stuff is going to be condensed and simplified and left unsaid. There is a fuller 20-minute presentation of this work on the UNESCO site that you can access if you're interested. Okay, so just want to get us started here in the context. The blue state here is Kenya. The yellow states surrounding Kenya are the countries of origin for the majority of young people who have sought asylum in Kenya. Many of those refugees living in Kenya are hosted in camps. So this work takes place in one of the 2 big camps in Kenya called Kakuma Refugee Camp in northwestern Kenya along the border with South Sudan. And I wanted to describe Kakuma through the eyes and words of a refugee young person, just to sort of get us grounded. So in the context of one of our conversations as a research team, one of the young people asked another in the group, how would you describe Kakuma to someone who doesn't know Kakuma? And after hesitating a little, Ibrahim said, I would describe a place, a temporary place where someone doesn't know about his future. You are not sure whether you will get out of this place. So every refugee camp is a little bit different, but these are some of the common features of settings of encampment. They're really not intended to be democratic places. They're not intended to be, civil society, and some might even argue they're not intended to be a community. So I want to highlight on this list this idea of enforced dependency, the idea that refugees are prevented from developing their full human potential because they're forced into positions of dependency by nature of the structural conditions, which impede physical movement and hinder access to legal employment and income earning opportunities. So this research I'm going to talk about began in 2015. It spanned 3 years, and there's kind of a new chapter happening right now in order to extend this work. I combined ethnographic methods and a youth participatory action research approach, or YPAR approach, in collaboration with students at one school in Kakuma. Students were in Form 3 or 11th grade when we began, and the idea behind this design was that I would be able to document their everyday experiences during their final years in secondary school and as they transitioned out. Now, at the same time, I facilitated this YPAR collaboration in hopes that as we identified challenges, which we knew in this context would be inevitable, we could think about how to use research to advocate for educational improvements that were meaningful and relevant to the young people involved. There's many ways to approach YPAR, but among the guiding principles, research is a collaborative process with shared decision-making throughout all stages. There's an assumption built into YPAR that the people embedded in the context under study are the actual experts, so experiential knowledge matters. And it also presumably involves this move from conceptualizing to collecting and analyzing data into action, into collective mobilization, so that you're acting on your findings. So there's elements of youth empowerment and civic praxis and critical consciousness that are key. I know that this model makes it look linear. It's really not linear. But what I want to emphasize here is the sort of Freirean theory of learning and consciousness raising that is embedded, in which critical inquiry allows for critical analysis, which can lead to critical action. So early on, one of the shared interests young people identified was the idea of non-material support around young people's educational pursuits in Kakuma. And this spanned academic and social supports, particularly around how these supports played a role in shaping access, motivation, experience, and persistence in schools in the camp. Together, we posed these research questions. We made decisions together about design. We collected and analyzed data together. And most of the data that we looked at was 30 interviews with community members, also mostly young people living in Kakuma, all of which were carried out by the youth researchers. There's sort of a meta question also happening here, more from my perspective as an adult outsider, white US citizen, non-refugee with all these identities that I carry, facilitating this work, asking how do we support YPAR, which is meant to be a transformative civic learning experience in a context like this that is not a civic space, where there are rigid constraints on young people's capacity to make claims given their legal status as non-citizens. So I'll walk through some of our most salient findings from the interviews. First, almost everyone we spoke with wanted to continue their education after secondary school. And so it was a finding that so many young people in Kakuma shared aspirations for post-secondary school. Recognizing this shared aspiration drew attention to the enormous gap between aspirations and the opportunity structure, or the opportunities available for fulfilling these aspirations in this context. At the time of the study, there was 1% of refugees globally who accessed tertiary education. That number has now risen to 3%, but likely still remains 1% when we're looking at Kakuma. And so we found that most people who completed school in Kakuma, most high school graduates, were actually sitting in the community with nothing to do. So this brings me to our third main finding. As we dug into an analysis of the opportunity structure, we realized that many young people who completed schooling lacked clear information about opportunities that were available for them. So coming back to our research questions, these social and academic supports were circulating. They were often circulating, however, as abstract advice in absence of important contextual information about what opportunities existed and how one might access them. They were also circulating in inequitable ways so that those with more wealth and status more readily accessed information, and in some cases actually kept that information from those with less wealth and status. So we began as a research team articulating this idea of information gaps that existed in the camp. Now, in terms of moving from collective analysis to collective mobilization, we set out to close these information gaps by compiling resources and opportunities for young people, and then carried out another layer of research as we went out and talked to all the agencies in the camp to try to understand how these opportunities worked, and created a web page where we house this information. So I want to just jump into this moment of collective mobilization where there were a number of doubts that began to emerge or reemerge around young people's capacity to do this work given their positioning in this space. So one day, pretty far into our planning, Karim, who was a really confident, outgoing member of the group, said, you know, we're not the kind of people that the organizations will give us the information. And this statement led to really interesting and important conversations about what it means to ask for information about services and programming as a refugee. And it revealed the belief that they, whose lives and livelihoods were shaped and constrained by these opportunities, should not be asking these questions, but that someone like me could, that somehow I would be more entitled to this information than they would. And I understand the hesitance here as a reflection of the ways that young people in this context have internalized their lack of agency to shape this space and to shape opportunities for themselves. So over the course of a few weeks, every youth researcher was able to talk to an agency representative. We were able to collect almost all of the data that we anticipated. And a number of young people were actually praised for their interest by the staff, rather than what they had worried about, which was that it might jeopardize their opportunities with these organizations. So here's Karim again, defining this term for us, information gaps. So he says, information gaps are when you don't understand how something is happening or why it is that way. You need to set your mind, but sometimes you do not know which are the right questions to ask. So far, this is sort of focused on a kind of information literacy where you need to identify what's the missing information here to make sense of your situation. And then he adds, and maybe you do not know you are a person who can ask these questions. So Karim's definition shows us there are actually these multiple dimensions to the ways that information is acting as a barrier. So there's this scope and substance of questions that are aimed at understanding the context and how educational opportunities are distributed and accessed. And then there's this dispositional piece, recognizing who has the power and agency to ask questions in this space. And both of these are important dimensions of youth civic agency, particularly for a refugee in this context where there are multiple, overlapping, ambiguous, and at times conflicting duty bearers who are accountable for rights and services. I want to tie this to Arjun Appadurai's concept of the right to research, which he explains is not frequently seen as a capacity with democratic potential, but in fact is a powerful and essential dimension of citizenship. So in designing a shared resource by, for, and with Kakuma youth, we illustrate that young people, even those lacking legal citizenship status, have the rights and the means to access information on which their everyday well-being and their future livelihoods depend. And when I think about where we begin and the ways that young people subsequently took control of this process, I think what we did was transformative. Our collaboration supported young people in claiming the right to research their community and understanding how access to information was empowering, just as these information gaps were impeding their sense of agency, their ability to plan for their future, and their ability to advocate for themselves. So I want to now introduce just a little bit of dissonance and invite you all to think with me here, because I think there's another way to tell this story. Through this collaboration, young people involved complicated their understanding of how opportunities were distributed. So they developed more critical understanding of the global and local structures as inequitable. But this critical awareness did not necessarily lead to desires for transformation. So to my surprise, youth researchers did not advocate for a more inclusive school system or set of opportunities that would better serve refugees as a group. Instead, we reasserted the logic of meritocracy, rationalizing that systems benefiting a few to the exclusion of the vast majority were reasonable and just in contexts of scarcity like Kakuma. They employed the tools of YPAR to actually reproduce meritocratic scripts around individualized hard work, regardless of the structural conditions in which refugees find themselves. And so in this sense, they naturalized educational inequity. So I'm sort of wrestling with that and what it means. And I'd love to think with others, especially my fellow panelists, about how we can understand how and why these complicated truths are coexisting. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this inspiring presentation. I would like to invite our next speakers to come on board. David, can you unmute yourself? David,
Thank you. I'm here now. Thanks, Peter. Michelle, thank you for an amazing presentation. Just reflecting on some of the things that Ibrahim and Karim said, most of the kids that I taught in 17 years of school teaching, even though they weren't in a refugee camp, they may as well have been in a refugee camp. They were the working class and intergenerational poor, who also themselves were experiencing enforced dependency. And they didn't know where they were really in the system, nor did they know how to get out of it. So I want to start my discussion, which is a 20-year journey of discovery of myself and how I can impact and how we can impact as intellectuals on the changes that are required in our system. I'm going to start in 2001. In 2001, together with a group of teachers and the help of some philanthropists, I developed a program called Are You Mad? Or as I like to say it, are you mad? In other words, are you making a difference? Working with teachers and school principals, we developed a toolkit that enabled young people to lead social change and become active citizens. It started with the young people themselves being asked to tell us what was unfair or what made them mad in society. Because generally, when we ask those questions, people say, oh, this and that makes me mad, like the fact that we are in a climate disaster. That makes me angry, that makes me mad. But someone should do something about it. And then we as facilitators would turn that back on them and say, well, what can you do about it? If you can't impact on the global situation, what can you do locally in your school, in your community? Which leads to a whole different viewpoint about their efficacy, self-efficacy, and it leads to basically transformational change. So it's focused on the values of the children themselves, of the students themselves, but benefits the whole community. And this program works from the earliest ages all the way through, and I've done it when I was at university as well, with my university students as well. So Are You Mad assists schools to deliver on the educational goals at the heart of almost every curriculum, and that is about civic participation, supporting equity and excellence in schools, and it supports students to become not just successful learners, as the students were in the refugee camp, not just confident and creative individuals, but most significantly, informed and active citizens. And so if anyone would like to get hold of this material, and it's free for anyone to use, the link is down the bottom of the page, or if you just Google Are You Mad, you will find it there. It's being used in schools and around Australia, and I understand internationally as well in some places, particularly in South Africa. So what did I discover through my work? In 2014, I was fortunate enough to be awarded a major research prize that enabled me to focus for 3 years on the teaching about democracy and teaching for democracy among school teachers in Australia. This was an Australian Research Council grant that actually I was able to buy myself out of teaching, if you like, which was a shame because I love teaching, but it enabled me to focus on this kind of research. And I worked together with the facilitator, the people behind this project, Paul Carr and Gina Tessé and others, where we started to talk about thick democracy. And this little linear, which is not linear, of course, but that's how we have to represent it. It actually should be three-dimensional, and I'll go into those 3 dimensions in a moment, is what I call the continuum of democracy, which is about participation, citizenship, and political activity. Too much of what we do with our young people in schools is we do a lot of barking, but no biting. And so we encourage active participation, but it actually does not have an impact on their social and cultural lives. And so based on the work of Westheimer and Kahn, as a result of my 3-year research program, I developed a 5-tiered understanding of citizenship in this continuum of democracy, from thin to thick democracy. On the left-hand side, we see the passively responsible citizen.
David, sorry, I need to interrupt you, but you're not showing the slides. So there's no left-hand side.
Oh, really? What's going on here?
Yeah, sorry for that.
I should have told me.
Well, I did PM you, but yeah.
Okay. Oh, I can't get back to my Zoom. Hang on. Let's see what's going on. Really sorry, everybody. I won't start again.
Perfect, we can see you now.
Okay, great. So on the left-hand side, we've got the passively responsible student going through to a personally responsible citizen, a participatory citizen, social justice-oriented citizen, and a social justice activist citizen. Again, I say this is based very firmly on the brilliant work of Westheimer and Kahn, but goes a step further. And we go, for example, what does the passively responsible citizen do? He or she obeys the laws, pays their minimum taxes, keeps their front yard clean if they have to, donates blood in exchange for money, perhaps. They help their family and close friends. And when they see a poor person on the street, they feel sorry for them, and maybe they throw them $1 or $2. The personally responsible citizen acts responsibly in the community. They pay their taxes due, and will pick up the rubbish voluntarily in the street and will voluntarily donate blood. They help strangers in times of need, like we have now with this COVID epidemic. And they may even contribute food to the hungry. The participatory citizen, he becomes an active member of community organisations, organises to care for those in need, promotes economic and development and clean environment. They do it in their home. They know how the government agencies work, and this is where we sort of leave the refugee camp. They know how government agencies work, and they are involved in working with them. And they might help to organise a food drive in their community. The social justice-oriented citizen, and this is where Westheimer and Kahn actually ended, they're able to assess social, political, and economic structures. They understand what's going on. They explore strategies for change. They know about social movements and how to affect social change. And they try to find out why some people are hungry and others are not, for example. But finally, on the right-hand side, we've got the social justice activist citizen. And they go one further, and they actually take action to prevent hunger locally and globally. And so what does that mean in the context of trying to solve social problems and improve societies? So the passively responsible citizen keeps to themselves, doesn't interfere with others. And that's the individualism that led to Trump, for example. The personally responsible citizens believe they must have good character, be honest, responsible, and law-abiding. And we see that typically in countries like Singapore. The participatory citizen contributes to community organisations within the established systems and community structures. The social justice-oriented citizen actively participates and leads within the established system and community structures. They'll join political parties, they'll get involved in campaigns, and even go out in the streets on demonstrations, for example, on key issues like climate change, the Black Lives Matters, etc. But the social justice activist citizen critiques and acts to change the established systems and structures that reproduce injustice. And this is probably reflecting on Michelle's presentation, this is where she wants to get the students, the young people in Kakuma to. So how do we do that? Well, we need to look at Roger Hart's ladder of young people's participation. Most of us will be familiar with that. The bottom three rungs are pure tokenism, where young people are infantilicized and they are not participating at all. They are just window dressing, if you like. We often find that in schools where we have student representative councils or of the kind, where they get to decide what day they might have an out of uniform day, or if they don't have to wear uniforms, who they might donate charity money to that they raise. At the top rungs, we've got young people who lead and initiate action, and where young people and adults share decision making. And that's where I wanted to get to right now. So based on that, last year I stood for local election in 2020 as a Greens candidate, which is probably the most radical establishment, if you like, party in Australia. The Greens party in Australia was the first political party that elected a Green to federal parliament, Bob Brown. We have 8 members of federal parliament at the moment, but in the state parliaments, we have many, many more members of parliament, 8 out of 120, I should say. And locally, we have representation in 36 councils in Victoria out of 45. So at the local level, the Greens are making a huge difference. And this is where I'll end my presentation. Developed a proposal for a youth voice to council. And I'd love to see this replicated all around the world. So at a local government level, each month, 2 students from the 38 schools in our city, and we have 140,000 people in our city, 38 schools, primary and secondary, so children from the ages of 12 to about 20 meet together on Zoom with local councillors and the Youth Advisory Committee of Council. They report back to their school for further input, discussion and ideas. And then the next month, it's a typo there, it's not the next month, it's next month, 2 new students from each school meet together on Zoom with our local councillors and the Youth Advisory Committee. And at the end of the year, we haven't gone through a year yet, but at the end of the year, we will be having a general assembly of all the past student representatives meet together in the town hall to deliberate, discuss, and set the agenda for next year. And this will be live streamed to all participating schools in the council district, 38 schools. And the potential is for, of course, for it to be streamed all over Australia, all over the world. So starting from the first principles of thinking local and thinking global and acting locally, this is where I've come to after 20 years in the education sphere, that I'm now retired from basically from university life, retired from public education, and I see this as the next step for the future. And that this youth voice to council, I think fits in beautifully with the next presentation, which is going to be talking about participatory budgeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David, for this very insightful and amazing actually presentation. I really like the idea of making a difference in such a participatory way. Anyway, without further ado, let's go to the third presentation of the panel.
Yeah, thank you. So Daniel Schugurensky and Tara Bartlett here from Arizona State University, Participatory Governance Initiative. This is a good segue, David and Michelle, to our presentation, because we are going to talk about participatory budgeting in schools. And I would like to challenge you, David, and think about how can we go beyond 2 students per school as representatives and scale it up to having processes that involve more students in the schools, not just a few groups of students. That's usually what happens when we do civic engagement programs in schools. We tend to work in terms of representatives or clubs, and sometimes through self-appointment, sometimes through teachers appointing students, sometimes elections, but there are only a few students who benefit from these processes, or when they are genuine. Sometimes there are simulations and you can have more students. So to me, the challenge for all of us is how can we more this participation accessible to as many students as possible, to give these opportunities to as many students as possible in the school. So we're going to talk about that, and this is one attempt. It's not the only attempt, but it's one tool that can help to do this. So we can have this conversation during the discussion period. So I would like to start, Tara, if you go to the next one, with 2 anniversaries this year. Yeah, next one. 2 anniversaries that deal with education, participation, and democracy. And the first anniversary is 100 years of Summerhill, which was one of the first, if not the first, school that had, if you can move, Tara, to the next one. Summerhill was the first school that had 2 characteristics. The first one was non-compulsory attendance by students, but the other one that is more interesting or more relevant to our conversation was school democracy, was a self-governed community in which the vote of a kindergarten student would have the same weight as the vote of a principal. And they made decisions about many things, and they had a legislative body, a judicial body, an executive body, etc., etc. And the other anniversary is Paulo Freire, born in 1921. And I would like to say a few words very briefly about each one of those, and then I will pass the baton to Tara. Next. As I said, Summerhill in England, 1921, A.S. Neal, a Scottish principal, started this school. And one of the main characteristics was self-governed, and the students took a leading role. So it was an example of trying to promote civic engagement and participatory democracy through self-governance in a school setting. And there are many schools all around the world now. There is a school democracy movement all around the world that are adapting some of the features of Summerhill. So after 100 years, I think it's time for us to reflect on these 100 years of experiences on school democracy and think about imagine what could be the next 100 years. How can we improve these models of school democracy as a self-governed community? And then Paulo Freire, he said many things, but he said education does not change the world, education changes people and people change the world. So how do we change people to become more democratic, more critical, more open-minded, more respectful of other people's opinions, more engaged, and so on? And we think that participatory budgeting is one of the many tools that can be used for this. And I would like to say a few words about each one. Next. So Summerhill, as I said, was one of the schools, one of the first schools that promoted school democracy and through a self-governing community. And Paulo Freire was an academic. He did lots of theory and so on. And we know many of his books, but I would like to mention two things of Paulo Freire as a practitioner. Paulo Freire was also a practitioner who put his ideas into practice. First, when he started his career in the 40s and 50s, when he worked as director of SESI, the Social Service of Industry, he organized this program around the principles of dialogue, self-management, and parliamentarization, which was a combination of study groups and action groups and collective decision-making. So it was very advanced for the time to promote an educational program that was built on a democratic decision-making process by the participants themselves. So, and then when he came back from exile to Brazil in the 80s and 90s, he became the Secretary of Education of Sao Paulo, and he started something called the Citizen School, Escola Cidadã, that was also about participatory democracy in the schools, with the participation of parents, teachers, and students, and participatory budgeting in Sao Paulo was part of that equation. That leads to my last slide, before I give the word to Tara. School participatory budgeting is just one tool among many tools to promote citizenship education, which means to nurture more informed, critical, and engaged citizens, and a problem-based and project-based citizenship education. It's also a tool for civic and political participation, for civic engagement, because students and sometimes also involving parents and teachers working together solve problems in the schools. And it is also a tool for an entry point for school democracy, to democratize the school setting. Now, one of the problems we had with school participatory budgeting for several years is what I mentioned at the beginning with David, a comment about the two representatives. We had steering committees, and the steering committees sometimes were not representative of the school community, and this created some inequities in opportunities to participate. So we try to address that through something that we call inclusive school participatory budgeting, and Tara will lead us to that. So then we can engage in a conversation after Tara's presentation. Go ahead, Tara. Thank you.
Thank you, Danielle. So school participatory budgeting, just starting off with what we know in terms of what works for pathways for students to feel empowered and engaged in democratic processes. 3 areas of support is 1, the school curriculum itself, needing to be experiential, a lot of problem and project-based learning, contextualized within their own communities in the sense of it being place-based, some applicability to outside the school and post their high school careers. Also the terms of self-reflective and interpersonal connections with the work that they would be engaged in. So those are what we know as proven research around democratic school curriculum. Also participation opportunities, as Danielle pointed out, not having the usual suspects within the school, as we call them, students that might already have opportunities for leadership positions and engagement, but really expanding beyond that and offering opportunities of learning by doing, action civics, as someone had pointed out in our previous session, validating voice, not necessarily giving voice, but validating the voices that students already have. And then collaborative learning that's transdisciplinary and of course inclusive. And the last pillar of support that we know works is this community support, having that student work directly connected to the community beyond the school, looking at the impacts that students can make themselves on the community in terms of service learning, and then community partnerships that bring in those community organizations to work across both the inner school and outer school communities. Something that we also know is that oftentimes civic engagement or democratic learning processes are inequitable in terms of opportunities. So this was pulled from a study that's cited down there below from Khan and Madah. And this research has revealed that there's inequitable opportunities that are pronounced along lines of race, class, ability, and normally those affluent, non-disabled white students are afforded more opportunities for participation in democratic learning. This can be seen in terms of the civic-oriented government classes, service learning opportunities, democratic simulations, exposure to and discussion of current events, and then also environments that are open to deliberative conversations. There's obviously a correlation beyond high school then that shows up in socioeconomic status, ability, and race in terms of the exposure and accessibility to participatory learning, and then the lifelong political and community participation. This is especially problematic, looking at some of the issues that were raised again today in previous sessions, that this can be an uneven community participation and political power dynamic that's then seen within our societies. Danielle, I don't know if you wanted to speak to a little bit of the history of participatory budgeting.
No, go ahead, Tara. Keep going. Thank you.
So participatory budgeting, we're drawing from our school version from the version that's done more at the municipal or community level. Essentially, it's a process of deliberation and decision-making around public monies or ballot allocations or budget allocations. And something to just remember is that budgets are policies without rhetoric and also show value systems. So these public dollars should be representative of what the public actually needs or wants. It began in Porto Alegre, Brazil in 1989 and has now spread to, I think that number is obviously grown. We're probably looking closer to almost 12,000 cities across the world amongst all continents. And we're really seeing the school version of participatory budgeting as a new wave of expansion of this civic participation model. And participatory budgeting follows the process that is shown here on the screen. It's a democratic process that takes community members, and in this case, students within the school, in terms of directly deciding how to spend a portion of a public budget. So in this case, it could be the school's budget. This is done through a democratic process where you can see the students designing that process, brainstorming ideas, then developing proposals to make those ideas come to full fruition. Those proposals are often presented to school boards or other decision makers within the school system itself and is given feedback, and the students return those ideas and feedback to their teams and then go ahead and develop a vote. And that vote is then decided in terms of the winning projects. Some of the innovations that we've seen is that this process has also embedded a primary vote along with a final vote to really mirror the true election process of primary candidates versus the final vote candidates. And again, the student steering committee that leads this process being more of a sample representative population of the school itself. And the next slide, I'm actually going to drop the video into the chat for everyone to watch afterwards, because I know we're getting short on time. But there is a video that does show a little bit of the school participatory budgeting process that's been done here in Phoenix, Arizona, within the US. And these students have put together a video that kind of shows how this process has worked. And I'll drop that link in the chat momentarily.
Yeah, the video is 4 minutes long, and you can also find it under the Center for the Future of Arizona website.
All right, Danielle, did you want to talk about the Arizona?
Keep going, Tara. Thank you. Keep going.
Okay. So here in Arizona in the US, we've kind of dubbed ourselves the experimental model for school participatory budgeting, really based upon 4 features. One is that the participatory budgeting model here in Phoenix, Arizona started within the school instead of what we've seen across the world, where it normally starts at the municipal level or the city and then is implemented within schools. So here it was actually the schools themselves that began this process. And now we've seen several cities pick up a similar version of participatory budgeting. We've also seen an incremental approach, as was pushed forth in our introduction. There was one school in 2013 that began this as just a pilot, and now school participatory budgeting is on over 40 schools in Arizona. So this has been a slow process, but an incremental approach, and not just a mass adoption that we've seen in other cities like New York City that had every single public school adopt it full scale from the get-go. The other feature is that it's done at different levels. So here in Arizona, we've seen school participatory budgeting done throughout the entire K-12 spectrum, from high school down to elementary schools, whereas in other places across the US and the world, it's normally done in just one age group and predominantly high schools. And the last feature of Arizona's school participatory budgeting experiment is that it's pioneering, in that it kind of unfolds and develops in one place that acts as a catalyst for others. And this is done not only within the process of itself, but also different practices, specifically our inclusive model that we're seeing more schools adopt as well. So school participatory budgeting here in Arizona is inherently inclusive, in that we have participating schools. 80% of them are Title I, meaning that a significant percentage of the school population is considered to be under the federal level of the poverty line. And these schools also range across the regions of our largest county in terms of population size, Maricopa County, and our 3rd largest county of the city, Tucson. And it's really the entire K-12 spectrum, as we had discussed. The second inclusivity pillar of school participatory budgeting in Arizona is the school-wide process that every student is involved. And really, we'll talk in a minute about concentric circles in terms of participation, where we have every student engaging at some point throughout the entire process, but also parents, teachers, and school staff. We've had parents and teachers and school staff also cast votes for the final projects that students had put forth. And we've also worked across with community partners, such as the county recorder's offices, to borrow their actual voting equipment and ballots to have the students use for the final vote. And then also worked with voter registration, so students that are of age to be registered to vote. We have organizations come in and actually get those students registered while they're voting in their participatory budgeting process at schools. And the last pillar of inclusivity is that this process is really contextualized and open to innovative ideas. We're going to talk about 3 case studies here that really show how these schools have taken the process and it's been molded to what it is that their school's context needs. So the first example of we've seen in terms of inclusive PD is the Carson Junior High model in Mesa, Arizona. And that is the concentric circles that I had alluded to before, where that center circle, the first circle, is really where we want to see the majority of students, because they are doing the most in terms of participation in governance and decision-making. And that second concentric circle on the outside, you can see the students do engage within the model at various important points throughout the different phases. And then that last circle, that third one is really just students that show up to vote. And this is kind of a microcosm of what we see even in our own elections here in the US and across the world in democracies, that the vast majority of people might show up to vote, but they haven't been necessarily engaged or informed throughout the entire process. So our role in this is really to reverse these circles and get the majority of people into that center circle. This model had inclusive representation where students, 41% of the student steering committee had a documented disability. So there was an overrepresentation of students with disabilities leading this process, but then also it was a sample that was representative along lines of race, gender, age, ethnicity that was represented within that student steering committee. And then there were the multiple opportunities for engagement. And then of course, the school-wide approach where we had parents that were also voting alongside the students with the ideas that the students had come up with. Side note, the winning project for this school participatory budgeting process was a school therapy dog. Second example that we have is the...
Can we perhaps move to conclusions? Sorry to interrupt you, but we have 10 more minutes for the whole session and for all the questions and answers and so on. Thank you very much.
Yes. I'll wrap up the last two and then we'll move into the questions. So just real quickly, another models, the school participatory budgeting model around school safety. The largest high school district within the state of Arizona has not renewed their contract with the Phoenix Police Department for school resource officers. And over the next 3 years, $3.6 million will be used in the school participatory budgeting process for students, teachers, and parents to decide how to reimagine school safety. And the last example, just really quickly, is having school participatory budgeting in a self-contained special education classroom. So all the students in this classroom have a documented disability, and they went ahead and did a spin-off of almost STEM and design thinking where they actually built models of their different ideas. And their final project was a Riding Safe campaign to have students mobilized around the idea of what it is to wear helmets and ride safely, bikes, scooters, etc. to school. And really, we've seen a jump in terms of the students' self-perceptions of belonging, their future plans to vote, and then also being empowered in terms of their decision-making. So I'll go ahead and end there. I will also, again, pop that video into the chat if anyone's interested in watching the video from Phoenix Union High School, and yield to questions.
Thank you very much for these beautiful presentations, all three of them. And this last one was really, 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 really inspiring to me. So any questions from the audience?
Questions or comments?
Comments, whatever, yeah.
Or sharing any experience that may be relevant to this topic.
I'll start off, Peter, if I may, because Daniel, as always, challenges me and it's been wonderful since the first time I met Daniel to discuss democracy and civic education way back in Toronto, I think at OISE.
With Paul Carr, actually.
Yes, with Paul Carr, exactly. My vision for the youth voice to council is to end up with the participatory budgeting. But I want to take the incremental approach that Tara talked about at the end of her presentation. And that is, we can't push too far, too fast, especially when you're working with conservative people. I'm only one of 9 on a council, and it only needs. I have 3 very good progressive colleagues, but who don't think the same way as I do. But we need to convince at least one other person out of 9 members of council to make policy. And then on top of that, we've got a bureaucracy, and you know that in any bureaucracy, the tendency is to inertia, and to come up with very creative ideas is always a challenge to the bureaucracy. and to conservatives in general. How do I envisage the future for the Youth Voice to Council is really where it's going to go. So when I broached this idea with the council staff and the other councils at first, they said, we have a youth advisory committee already. We have youth leaders. We select them each year and they get training, etc. And as Daniel said, these are the typical usual guys who get elected, those with good education, who are well known in the community, good sports, etc. And I said, that's not what we need to achieve. We need to achieve maximum participation. And so by having 2 different students each month come to a meeting, and then they report back to their school, which then might work on, for example, a project like the RU-MAD project, or which is participatory budgeting, if you like, starting from what the students want. We'll encourage active citizenship, civic and political participation, and of course, broader school democracy. So it's got the potential to develop in the future where all the schools participating can actually tune in for a 1-hour session once a month and watch their representatives to make sure that their representatives are representing them correctly. And when they come back to the school reporting, and then they vote on what they've talked about, so we can get maximum participation. I think this all comes down to a couple of ideas that I was able to develop as part of my PhD research way back in 2007. And I called it core pedagogy, CORE, connecting the children through education, where the children own the education process, where their education responds to their needs. And because it comes last, it's the most important. It empowers them to know that what they're doing will make a difference in their lives. And this is where I think the young people in Kakuma need to go. All that's what we do, and then how we do it is what I call pedagogical reciprocity, which is a Freirean understanding of teaching and learning together. Teachers and students learning with and from each other. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think this is a beautiful ending for a beautiful session. It's exactly 6:45 at mine. It's earlier at yours, but the session is officially finished. This is officially over.
Just one quick word. There is a question from Grace. And in relation to that question, I could just mention the school participatory budgeting on school safety in Phoenix. She can take a look at that. That's all.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Sorry for that. It's a huge symposium. There's so much going on. We have next sessions in a few minutes, and we just need to move on. I would like to thank all the speakers. I would like to thank all the participants and, of course, the organizers for making this event happen. Thank you once again.